Somewhere in a storage room in Munich, a computer is quietly doing something that took human beings 150 years to even attempt properly. It is reading broken clay. Not one piece. Thousands of pieces at once, comparing the jagged edge of a shard sitting in a German museum to the jagged edge of a shard sitting in a museum in London, in Chicago, in Baghdad, looking for the one thing no human scholar could ever realistically check by hand, where the two broken halves of the same 5,000-year-old sentence are sitting on opposite sides of the planet, waiting to be put back together. And in the last few years, it has actually found matches. Real ones. Sentences that had been unreadable for a century, suddenly whole again. That is not science fiction. That is happening right now, and it is quietly changing what we know about the oldest writing on Earth. Before we go further, a promise. Everything in this video is going to stay on the side of what can actually be shown, checked, and footnoted. Ancient Mesopotamia does not need embellishment. The real texts the Sumerians and Babylonians left behind are strange enough, honest enough, and unsettling enough on their own terms, without anyone needing to dress them up as a hidden message from the stars. What you're about to hear is what the tablets actually say, how artificial intelligence is actually helping us read them, and what serious historians actually think it means. No secret alien blueprint. Just 5,000 years of human beings trying to explain to themselves why they exist, why they suffer, and why they die, and a machine that is finally letting us hear all of them speaking at once. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the scale of the problem historians have been sitting on for over a century. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay by the Sumerians and later borrowed by the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, is one of the very first writing systems human beings ever invented. It emerged in the cities of southern Mesopotamia, in Uruk, in Ur, in Nippur, more than 5,000 years ago, and it stayed in use for roughly 3,000 years after that. Over that span, people wrote down an almost unimaginable amount: tax receipts, court rulings, medical prescriptions, star charts, love poems, and mixed in among all of it, some of the oldest myths in human history, stories about the creation of the world, the making of the first people, and a catastrophic flood that very nearly ended everything. The problem is that archaeologists dug up far more of this material than anyone could ever read. Estimates vary, but there are believed to be somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million cuneiform tablets sitting in museum collections around the world right now. The British Museum alone holds well over 100,000. Most of them have never been fully translated. Many have never been translated at all. Cuneiform is genuinely brutal to learn. It isn't an alphabet. It's a mixture of signs that can represent whole words or individual syllables depending on context, and a single symbol can be read multiple different ways depending on the sentence around it. A scholar might spend an entire career becoming fluent in Akkadian or Sumerian, and still only personally read a few thousand tablets in a lifetime. Multiply that bottleneck across a field with a genuinely small number of specialists worldwide, and you get museum storerooms full of clay that has been sitting, catalogued, but unread, since it was excavated over 100 years ago. On top of that, the tablets themselves are broken. Wars, floods, fires, and just the ordinary collapse of mud brick cities over thousands of years have left most surviving cuneiform documents in pieces. A corner here, a middle section there, sometimes just a few lines out of what was originally a much longer text. And because these fragments were excavated at different times by different expeditions and sent to different countries, the two halves of the same tablet often ended up in two different museums, catalogued under two different numbers, described by two different scholars who never had any reason to compare notes. For decades, putting these fragments back together, a process called joining, depended entirely on a specialist happening to remember, or happening to notice, that one broken piece looked like it might fit another one they'd seen years earlier in a completely different collection. It was slow, it was rare, and it depended almost entirely on luck. This is exactly the kind of problem computers are good at, and in the last several years, Assyriologists have started building tools to attack it directly. The most significant of these is a project called Fragmentarium, part of the Electronic Babylonian Literature initiative led by Assyriologist Enrique Jimenez at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. The project has digitized tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets and fragments, transcribed as much of their content as possible, and built machine learning tools that scan for matches, sequences of text, patterns of sign use, even physical shape and wear on the clay, that suggest two separate fragments in two separate collections might actually belong to the same original document. Since it launched, the project has been credited with helping identify dozens of new joins between fragments that had sat unconnected for a century or more, some of them completing lines of famous literary works that had been missing for generations of scholarship. Separately, in 2023, a team of computer scientists and Assyriologists, including Shai Gordon, Guy Guthers, and colleagues, published research on a neural machine translation system trained specifically to translate Akkadian cuneiform directly into English. Their model was trained on tens of thousands of existing translated tablets, learning the patterns of the language the way modern translation software learns the patterns between, say, French and English. It isn't perfect, and the researchers themselves are careful to say it isn't a replacement for expert human translators. But it produces genuinely useful draft translations in seconds for texts that might otherwise sit untranslated for years simply because there aren't enough trained Assyriologists in the world to get to them. Think of it less like a magic decoder ring and more like the world's most specialized, most overworked research assistant, one that never gets tired and can hold far more of the existing corpus in mind at once than any single human scholar realistically could. So what happens when you point tools like this at the actual body of Sumerian and Babylonian mythology? You don't get a secret hidden message. You get something arguably more interesting, a clearer, more complete picture of stories we already partly knew, with the gaps filled in and the connections between different versions made visible in a way they never quite were before. And those stories, read in full, are genuinely strange by modern standards. Not because they are hiding some forbidden truth, but because they represent one of the very first times human beings tried to put into words why they exist at all. The most important of these is a text modern scholars call the Atrahasis epic, an Akkadian composition that survives across multiple tablets and multiple time periods, some of the oldest copies dating back nearly 4,000 years. The myth describes a time before humans existed, when the lesser gods, called the Ijiji, were forced to do all the hard labor of the world, digging canals, working the earth, while the senior gods rested. Eventually the Ijiji rebel, refusing to keep working, and the senior gods, led by the god Enlil, agree to solve the problem by creating a new kind of being to take over the labor, humanity. In the myth, the mother goddess Nintu, working with the god of wisdom Enki, mixes clay with the blood of a slain god and shapes the first human beings, specifically so they can carry the burden the gods no longer want to bear. It's a myth about labor, hierarchy, and the uncomfortable idea that human beings were, in this telling, made to work. Later in the same epic, the human population grows so large and so noisy that it disturbs Enlil's rest, and he sends first plague, then drought, then finally a catastrophic flood to reduce or wipe out humanity entirely, only for Enki to secretly warn a man named Atrahasis to build a boat and save his family, along with animals and craftsmen, so that humanity survives. If that structure sounds familiar, it should. The same basic flood narrative appears again in the Sumerian king list tradition, again in the story of Ziusudra in the Sumerian flood myth, and again, centuries later, in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is named Utnapishtim. Scholars have long recognized these as closely related versions of the same underlying tradition, one that almost certainly influenced the much later flood narrative in the Hebrew Bible, written down roughly 1,000 years afterward. This isn't a fringe theory, it's one of the most well-established points of comparative literature in the ancient Near East, taught in university classrooms, not whispered about in forbidden corners of the internet. There's also the myth of Adapa, a much shorter and more fragmentary text, but one that AI-assisted reconstruction work has helped clarify in recent years by connecting scattered fragments from different sites. In it, a wise man named Adapa, created by Enki and granted intelligence, but explicitly denied immortality, is summoned before the sky god Anu after accidentally breaking the wind and angering the gods. Enki warns Adapa beforehand not to eat or drink anything he's offered in the heavens, fearing it will kill him. But when Adapa arrives, Anu instead offers him the bread and water of eternal life, and Adapa, following his god's warning, refuses it, permanently losing humanity's one shot at immortality. It's a myth that reads, on its surface, as a story about obedience and missed opportunity, and scholars have debated for decades exactly how to interpret Enki's motives, whether he was protecting Adapa from real danger, testing him, or simply mistaken. The text is fragmentary enough that even now, no one claims to have a final answer, AI-assisted reconstruction included. What ties these myths together, and what modern Assyriologists have pointed out for generations, long before any of this AI tooling existed, is a consistent Mesopotamian worldview. Human beings were created by the gods, for the gods, primarily to relieve the gods of labor and to serve them through ritual and offering. Mortality wasn't a punishment for disobedience in the way later traditions would frame it. It was simply baked into the design from the very beginning, a deliberate boundary between human and divine that stories like Adapa's dramatize rather than explain away. It's a worldview that is genuinely bleaker and more transactional than a lot of people expect when they first encounter it, and that bleakness is exactly why these texts are worth reading on their own terms, rather than needing a modern conspiracy layered on top to make them feel significant. This is really where the AI angle earns its place in the story, and where it's worth being precise about what it is and isn't doing. It is not uncovering a suppressed message. It is not revealing that ancient scribes secretly knew something modern science doesn't. What it is doing is something more like archival triage on an almost unimaginable scale, scanning tens of thousands of digitized tablets for patterns of sign sequences, physical breaks, and stylistic fingerprints that suggest two pieces belong together, surfacing candidate joins for human experts to verify, and producing draft translations of texts that might otherwise never get translated at all simply because there aren't enough qualified people to do it by hand. Every join the Fragmentarium project identifies still gets checked by a trained Assyriologist before it's accepted. Every machine-translated passage from the Akkadian model is treated as a starting point for expert review, not a final answer. The people building these tools are, without exception, extremely careful to say this out loud, because the alternative, letting an unverified pattern-matching system quietly become the final word on a 5,000-year-old text, is exactly the kind of mistake a responsible field cannot afford to make. And yet even with all of that caution built in, the actual results have been remarkable. Fragments that sat in separate drawers on separate continents for 100 years have been reconnected. Lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh and other major literary works that were missing for generations of scholarship have been partially restored. Texts that would otherwise have waited decades for a specialist to get around to them have gotten usable draft translations in a fraction of the time. The bottleneck that Assyriology has quietly struggled against for a century and a half, too many tablets, too few scholars, too little time in a single human career, is finally starting to loosen, not because a machine understood something people couldn't, but because a machine can hold and compare an amount of material that no single human mind ever could, and hand the interesting matches back to the people qualified to judge them. So where does that leave the actual question in the title? What did AI-assisted translation reveal about humanity? Not a hidden origin story. Not proof of ancient genetic engineering or extraterrestrial visitors. What it revealed, and is continuing to reveal, is a fuller, more connected, more legible version of what the very first literate civilization on Earth believed about itself, that human beings were created to work, that mortality was a built-in feature rather than a punishment, that the line between human and divine was drawn on purpose and guarded carefully, and that even 5,000 years ago, people were already grappling with the same questions that still keep us up at night: why we're here, why we suffer, and why, no matter how wise we get, we don't get to live forever. The tablets don't need an ancient astronaut theory to be extraordinary. They are extraordinary because they are real, because they are finally being read in full for the first time in human history, and because the questions inside them are still, unmistakably, ours. If you found this as fascinating as I did, the Electronic Babylonian Literature Project and its Fragmentarium tool are publicly browsable online, and the 2023 Akkadian translation research is published and open for anyone to read. This isn't a closed field guarding secrets, it's an open one, quietly rewriting itself in real time, one reconnected fragment at a time. And that, to me, is a far better story than any invented one could ever be.